So welcome back to another episode of the Financial Bites podcast. I'm your host and social media CPA, Chris Passmore. Well, today I'm so excited to discuss the current status of M&A activity with my guest, Christian Schiller. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Chris.
Yeah. So for our audience, Christian is the managing director at Cascadia Capital, an investment bank serving middle markets globally. So I'd love to just jump into that, Christian. Tell us a little bit more about how you ended up at Cascadia Capital. How did you become the managing director? And maybe talk about the types of clients you work with.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I'm kind of a boring guy. I mean, I've had a career almost 30 years and only done one thing, which is investment banking. And actually, even before that, my mom was one of the first women investment bankers in the industry back in the 80s and 90s. And so I think I knew what EBITDA was when I was like 7 years old. And, just from osmosis of talking with the family dinner table and stuff. So, I always knew I wanted to work with private kind of family businesses is really my passion and what drives me. And so the first almost 10 years of my career, I was in Chicago, actually working on the other side for private equity firms on the buy side. And then my best friend from college was one of the second hire at Cascadia back in 99, 2000 when they started. So I got a call from him and wanted to recruit me out to start up a traditional industries business. They had been more in tech in that period. This is like 99 to 2003 when I finally made the nod to move from Chicago to Seattle. I called it my Control-Alt-Delete on life because my wife and I lived a block from Wrigley Field, and we're having a roaring time in our 20s and young 30s. And we'd had a 2-year-old kid and trying to figure out raising the city or suburbs and couldn't agree. So we just said, Control-Alt-Delete, we're going to move to Seattle, start over. I knew my best friend, and that's it. And, kind of the rest is history. 20 years later, almost at Cascadia of building this business with all of our teammates. And, the kind of clients that we serve, we started actually really exclusively serving founders, families, and entrepreneurs. And, again, that's what I shared with you, my passion, because there's so much psychology and value add that you can provide to them because it's usually the first transaction they're ever doing in their life. It's the biggest transaction of their life. I always say a family business, it's kind of if they're going to sell their business, it's like, who do you marry and have kids and buy your house? I mean, that's one of the next biggest things you do in your life, and it's only one time. So that's where we started and really have built a franchise. That's about 80% of our business today. And then actually last year we expanded into the financial sponsors coverage, hired a guy, Scott Ames from Lazard. And so now about 20% is private equity or institutional selling for them for their portfolio companies.
So I want to say you're the only investment banker I know who literally his mom was one of the originals, and probably with learning the ABCs 1, 2, 3s, I can imagine, a 3-year-old you. What was your second word? Maybe your first word was mom. Your second word was EBITDA.
So was EBITDA. Yeah. Well, it's kind of funny, but kind of sad too, I guess. But you fall in where you're placed.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I mean, to your point about that focus on the type of business, the privately held, family owned, I mean, you're absolutely right. A transaction, a sale is right up there in like a top 3 life event of, married, child, sell a business. I mean, so your role in a significant life event for a business owner can't be understated.
No, it's just so rewarding, really. And, and we always think of it holistically too. That's one of the ways that we really try to approach it is, obviously everybody wants to drive most valuation, but, we don't stop there. We always ask families and entrepreneurs before we get started in our process, what else is important to you and what else do you want to see? And then importantly, what do you not want to see happen? And like one of our clients taught me, Dick Crossley from Tillamook Country Smoker, a deal we did. He taught me the grocery store test. And the grocery store test was that he lived in a small area of Tillamook, Oregon, and he wanted to make sure that when he'd sold his business and then he ran into an employee in the grocery store afterwards, he didn't want to have to shy away or, not pretend not to see him. He wanted to be able to be happy and proud about the deal he did and that they would come up and hug him and thank him. And so we always think about that holistic. You want to get a great valuation outcome, but you also want to figure out what are all the qualitative, not just quantitative aspects that are important in a deal. And it's not an either or world. It's a both and world. You can often find the right counterparty that'll both, do both things, pay the most, and also adhere to all the important qualitative aspects in the transaction.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an important thing. So let's dive right into it. And to give our audience a background of overall M&A activity over the past few years, 2021 was record-breaking number of deals. It was an absolutely fantastic year. 2022 followed by a slight decline. It's hard to follow any record year. And then 2023, there's a lot of optimism, but there's a lot going on. We have, recessionary headwinds. We've got potential inflationary issues, stock market volatility, Ukraine. But I read about unprecedented dry powder that could provide significant opportunities for the right sellers. So I'm going to have you bring out your crystal ball real quick, Christian. What's your prediction of M&A activity this year with everything going on and everything we've been through in the past few years?
Yeah, sure, Chris. So I would say that, our prediction, so it's not just mine, but the Cascadia platform, we've talked about this, as you'd imagine, ad nauseum. And so what we believe is that, what we've invested in growth right now, and we just raised a lot of capital last year for growth from Atlas Merchant, a firm. And so, what we're not betting on 1 or 2 good years, but on, 20 or 30 good years. And it's really the cycle of there is almost perpetually, forevermore now, way more capital than there are companies, especially on the family business side. And so the supply demand is, an oversupply of capital, chasing ever fewer increase of quality deals. And so from that macro trend, you can get into the variability, obviously, within any period of a quarter, month, or a year. But, that's important to have as an overhang. Because literally, if you look at like PitchBook, every single year, the fund overhang of uninvested capital continues to increase. The number of companies in private equity portfolios continues to increase. So that's what gives us, kind of the strength of spirit to believe in the long-term business of M&A and optimizing, with and through cycles. So with that said, things have changed dramatically, as you had talked about. 21, it was like you could almost throw any deal up and somebody would pay, and you get 15 bids and they're all good bids. It did seem a bit academic, in that. 22 did start to soften and slow down. But yeah, I would say that the key difference, and this is where we've had to make wholesale changes in our business, from taking on most of the deals that are given to us to passing on most of the deals that are presented to us. 80 or 90% we pass, looking for that A company, A minus company. And then the laws of supply demand are interesting, because as long as a company is growing still, as long as a company has no kind of hair on it, customer concentration, not a full management team, things like that. What we found is that actually those companies are getting as high, if not even almost to some counterintuitiveness, higher valuations than what they were before, because you have that same amount of capital now chasing, say 20% of the opportunities, versus in 21, everybody was growing and everybody was doing well. And so the discernment and flight to quality in the market with the same amount of capital chasing those fewer A deals has really created an amazing opportunity for the companies which can put themselves in that A deal category. And that's really where we're trying to then focus all of our time. And I know later we'll talk about, a little bit more about that. But we believe essentially, and I think some of the public market stuff that you're seeing is really pointing towards that, what the markets are looking is for an end to rate increases. And then when that, comes into play, then we believe there's going to be a real rush back into the M&A. And is that, Q3 or Q4, we can debate, but it's, likely sometime this year that you're going to at least see a firm end, or at least, kind of a flattening of the rate increase environment. That's been the one tamper on the M&A side.
I mean, it blows my mind to think that if you're an A company, which means, strong management, great strategy, well positioned in the industry, that, I mean, you still might get a valuation what was either equal to or greater than, 21, the best year ever. I mean, that, if you think about everything that's happening in the world right now, that blows my mind. Yeah. I mean, it's just, like you said, it's counterintuitive to think that for those A companies, this is the time to sell if you're even thinking about it, because of the valuations that are out there. To your point about the demand, I mean, it's so counterintuitive.
Yeah, it's the capital markets has not gone away. It's just changed, so opportunity doesn't go away. It just changes form. And, you need to, I know, again, we'll talk about this later, because you got to really be very introspective and self-selective about whether you fit to go into market, because, it's a huge waste of time if you kind of try to chase rainbows as opposed to, attack it from a pure fundamentals basis.
Yeah. And I'm sure you have that discussion with prospective clients that even years ago, when you wait for the right time, you make sure it's right for the company, and necessarily valuations doesn't come into the discussion. But when valuations are at record amounts, it's almost impossible to ignore that point. I mean, it's like if you have any investment and it's at a record high, even if you didn't plan to sell that investment, you have to consider it, because there's the possibility that 2-3 years from now, if those valuations pull back, that there could be money left on the table. So I imagine that has to be a part of every discussion now of, well, if you weren't planning to go to market for 3 years, there's a risk your multiple might go from, X to Y.
Yep. Yeah, no, that's it's interesting, because for us to be investment bankers, it's a little counterculture, counterintuitive. But I would tell you that when we diligence a company about whether we should take it to market, I'd say 9 times out of 10 we say no, wait. And my personal record is 21 years of dealing with a founder family business, meeting with them and talking with them nearly every quarter for 21 years prior to punching the ticket that now's the time. And very often we wait 3, 5, or 7 years. So we really take that very seriously about making sure to do your diligence, make sure that you're the valuation, whatever the number is the business owner wants, say it's 150 million, we want to feel about 90% confident that 150 million is achievable as a threshold, and that we can in fact beat that. And if it's not that, then we don't want to take it to market. It's got to be high confidence, not chase rainbows again. So there's it's just a very nuanced thing, but you want to be very diligent about thinking about what kind of company you are, what kind of market it is, and is the connection to the price that you want highly achievable.
Well, it also says a lot about your team that you're willing to forgo an opportunity, revenue today, for what's best for the clients. Your example, 21 years. So let's kind of talk about the benefits of hiring an investment banker, because for several people out there with the business, they may have never done a sale before. They're not multiple, like serial entrepreneurs selling it over and over again. So can you share with our audience just the general advantages of hiring an investment banker to help them through a sale of their business?
Sure. Yeah. And I always try to take a humble approach to this, because at the end of the day, we're not rocket scientists. We are investment bankers. And so, often you can get a deal done without an investment banker. It's not like we're requisite or critical to the successful close of a deal. I think where we do come in is that we are really critical to optimizing a deal. And so, for a business owner that doesn't have a fiduciary board or isn't a public company, they can decide to do whatever they want, right? So if they get a bid unsolicited from a private equity firm or a strategic at 60 million, and they're happy with 60 million, take that and close with a lawyer, and you doing kind of QV and whatever work on that, that's perfectly fine, right? From all aspects for them to do that. Without an investment banker, pay no fee. That's usually the issue, is they say, well, I save a fee. I think what they're missing is, unless you have, that's probably a lightning strike scenario, that you get the perfect buyer, great price, and can close a deal without diligence issues and all that kind of stuff. So if you don't think that you're in a lightning strikes kind of scenario, then hiring an investment banker, like our record is taking a $200 million initial term sheet and closing at $440 million. So these aren't small amounts of money that you're potentially leaving on the table. And back to, if you're the type of person that this is the biggest deal in your life, and you only did it once in your life, why would you take the chance that you're leaving, probably tens and tens of millions, and maybe to get 20 million more, you're going to pay a fee of $1 million and net 19 million, more, right? That's kind of the equation. So that's where an investment banker comes in, is they can run a tight process. They can also help you to, and this is where, where we work with you guys a lot, is, make sure that you get prepared and ready. so that you essentially have all of your diligence done before you talk to a single buyer. And then that way that avoids the retrade risk, it avoids the diligence, because a lot of companies, have some warts on them, and it's better that we find them before, then we can address them, resolve them. Even if we can't resolve them, we can tell the story around them so that the buyers aren't surprised, and then they just incorporate that into their process and their deal. And because the last thing you want to, and where retrades happen, is where you have surprise. But if you know the issues and disclose the issues, then you can work around them, and then the buyer comes back and they have no foot to stand on because there are no surprises that have come up in the deal. And so that's how we try to, it's the preparedness aspect of an investment banker is almost as important as the value and optimization part of an investment banker.
And just to make sure the audience didn't miss that example, and I realize that may be the best example, but you had a transaction that maybe started at 200 and ended at 400 plus. So I mean, through the value added in the process, you were able to double the proceeds for the seller.
Yep. And that's with a different buyer. So that was more on competitive tension, but we've actually closed deals where we've had the same buyer. We've gotten involved late stage. They didn't want to hire us for a process, but they only wanted to hire us to optimize with that buyer. And often we can add 50% to value, and then we can even value base our fee, so that we're getting that kind of higher on the marginal value that we add and put our money where our mouth is. That's a good way to deal with an investment banker, even if you have a kind of actionable deal that you want to do and not do a process.
So you're talking about optimizing value, or making sure that the company you're dealing with is paying the best price possible, whether that is with one company or going to market with a couple different companies to make sure that the value is the best price for the seller. It's helping the team make sure there's no skeletons in the closet, to use an old phrase, that there's nothing that's going to ruin the deal after hundreds and hundreds of hours of work. So making sure that all of those issues are pre-addressed with, and therefore when you actually have a sale and diligence is going on, it can all be like, yeah, it's been crossed off, we're doing fine now. And then just making sure that the seller is surrounded by the right team, whether that's a CPA, an attorney, or maybe a financial advisor to talk about the post-closing proceeds. It sounds like through that whole process, I mean, the investment bankers are the quarterback, kind of carrying the team to the end zone.
Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. And again, the most important part of this that I don't want to leave out is taking all of that potentially leave for later diligence and issues and move that all to immediately in the front part of the process. That's a bit counterintuitive for some people, because oftentimes, sellers say, well, until I know I want to sell, I don't want to spend, hundreds of thousands of dollars on retainers and QofEs and, other things like that. But that's kind of penny wise, pound foolish. If you're really a seller, you really should put all that up front, dot your I's, cross your T's, and then go to market, because that's where you're going to optimize the income or the outcome, and make sure that you get an efficient deal done.
Well, so you talk about moving things to the beginning of the process. So when should a hire actually retain an investment banker? How far ahead of time? I mean, is there kind of a rule of thumb of, we generally want this many months or this many years to get you prepared?
Well, so I'll answer that in two ways, because I think the one answer is, that it probably takes about 6 to 9 months at least to go through a process. And that preparedness process is the better part of 2 months. And so, if you want to sell, sometime in the next year, you want to hire an investment banker, sometime in the next few months, that's kind of the point of interaction. What I would say, and what went to my 21 years in our culture is, one of the mistakes we think business owners make is they say, I don't want to sell, so I don't want to engage in even a dialogue with an investment banker. And we think that doesn't really make sense, because what we can do is add a ton of value to take a business from, let's say, real case examples. I've worked with company owners when 5 years before they were worth 40 or 50 million, and they didn't know how and didn't have the roadmap to get to 150 million, but they wanted to do it. So we got involved. We don't charge anything. We don't send them a contract, so it's all gratis, and most investment bankers do this. And we really ripped their business apart, and we looked at where they were too low margin, where some of their sales channels were not optimal. We kind of put the buyer lens on their business. And then that was essentially free consulting that they could then take. And because they had years, they could work on that. So like in that case, we were able to take that business from 40, 50 million to, selling it for, about $150 million. And we'd worked with that owner almost every single quarter to just check in. And again, it's gratis. It's like bankers don't charge for that because, we have a long-term perspective on looking at the big success fee. So as long as you're willing to kind of, get close with us and that, you can get a lot of ROI and value. So that's another maybe not obvious perspective about when to at least start working with an investment banker as opposed to a formal engagement.
Okay. So, I mean, it sounds like, generally rule of thumb, a year is good. Maybe if you have some cleanup to do, maybe a little bit more than that, but at least a year ahead of time. I can tell you right now from my perspective, from the tax and accounting perspective, yeah, at least 1 year. It's always funny when you get a call saying, hey, I'm closing next week. Can you look at this? And the response is typically, I don't know if I can do a lot on the day's notice. So multiple years in advance, but it sounds like at least a year in advance to help get prepped, get the company ready, and then run a formal process.
Yeah. Well, you're hitting on a good point, because if you want to put in place, trusts or any kind of tax minimization as part of a transaction, that has to straddle a couple of years at least of tax years, and you want to get that in place well in advance of a deal. And those kind of trusts can save tens of millions in a deal, right? So that's the other aspect. That's not so much the investment banker side, but just making sure that you're prepared from all aspects of a deal will save you tens and tens of millions usually.
Yeah. So to just emphasize that to the listeners is that generally the advice here is to talk to advisors early, because there's a whole lot of really powerful things we can do, whether that's Christian's team in the investment banking side, a team like mine on the accounting side, that there are powerful tools that you can take advantage of a year ahead of time, 2 or 3 years ahead of time. A week ahead of time, not so much.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that was actually one of the common mistakes you see, is that they don't engage you in time. But what are some of the other types of common mistakes that you see out there in transactions by sellers? Maybe someone who didn't engage an advisor or didn't talk to an investment banker and thought they could do everything on their own.
Yeah, well, I can answer this one easily from the most important mistake and the one that should never be made, and that is on the financial projections. That often business owners have run their business with no debt, and whether they do this or that on EBITDA or revenue doesn't really matter that much. They don't have a board, those kind of things. But when it comes time to sell, you have to dial that in, absolutely, and you got to dial that in on monthly financials, quarterly financials, and you have to make your numbers. That's the number one reason the deals die or get massively retraded, is missing financials during a process. It's absolutely paramount, thus, and that's the biggest mistake, is that, sellers sometimes think, well, if I'm aggressive on my projections, that's going to help me because, buyer's going to get excited and then I'm going to sell for more. It's actually the inverse, that if you, get overly aggressive and you miss your numbers, you're going to absolutely, brutally negatively affect your valuation. Whereas if you sandbag a little bit, to use maybe an overly strong term, and you come out and, what our favorite call always is to the market when, we have to update our clients' numbers, because the projections are no longer valid, and the buyers will say, well, how far did they miss by? You say, no, we're going to overperform, so we're going to move our projections up. And you do that, close to bid date or things like that. And that just builds a lot of confidence and a lot of momentum. And so, that's probably the biggest thing. And then, the second biggest thing is what we talked about already, the preparedness. Lack of full 100%, literally to a T preparedness, skipping any part of that step is a major mistake. And then I would also say, the final thing I would say is really thinking through that qualitative aspect of it, not just thinking price and not just thinking terms, but what else is important to you in a deal, and having good answers to that. It could be making sure that all my employees retain their jobs and aren't fired. It could be not moving headquarters. It could be, that I really want, my family members to maintain a job, even if, frankly, some might not be adding as much value, but, that's important. Or, or what kind of value do you want out of a buyer? What do you want them to bring to bear to your company, as opposed to just money, that's another big one that we say, what other value are you seeking for in a private equity or strategic buyer partner outside of the money? And then making sure that you really not just tie the valuation, but sometimes our clients take the second highest bid because the actual value added by that buyer is much higher than the highest bidder. And so they believe, especially if you're doing like a private equity rollover and you're going to keep 20 or 30% of that, that if somebody can impact your business to the positive for the next whole period of 5 years and sell for a lot more, and you've got 20 or 30% of that, that's nirvana, when you sometimes can make more on that deal than you made on the full original deal.
Well, it's funny you bring that up. I had that a very exact situation happen with a client of ours that was in the staffing business. They had rollover equity, 20, 30%, tripled in size. They rolled over a second time and they participated in 3 transactions. And to your point, each one was bigger than the one before. So I guess that emphasizes, the biggest dollars today may not be the biggest dollars in the long run.
Right. That's great example.
So yeah. And the other thing I heard is under promise and over deliver. Is that pretty much that first point?
That's always rule number one. Yeah.
Rule number one. So it's always this part in the podcast. I'd like to take a quick pause from the technical stuff, just so the audience can learn a little bit more about you personally, what I call the backside of the card, something that you enjoy outside of work. So for me personally, I'm an avid mountain biker, so I'm out in the trails all the time, going places I shouldn't go, seeing rattlesnakes and everything else. So tell our audience one backside of the card thing about you.
Oh, well, this one's fun always. So as you can see right behind me, I've got a painting of Wrigley Field back when I moved out here in 2003, 2004. It looks a lot different now. So I was riding with my wife out here in Seattle, and actually at a gallery here in Seattle, they had this unbelievably. So I bought this and put this up. But my life's passion in sports is the Cubs. I lived in Chicago, a block from Wrigley Field, when Sammy Sosa was hitting all those home runs, and just went to tons of games on Fridays at Wrigley Field. And, it's kind of they say it's the world's biggest bar, but a baseball game going on in the background. And it was a lot of fun. And so you kind of don't forget those formative days. And so the Cubs, I've gotten a little crazy. I named my third kid Addison, which is the address of Wrigley Field. My dog's name is Wrigley. Because I moved to Washington State from Illinois, I could actually get one license plate straight Cubs and the other straight Wrigley. So my kids drive the Wrigley car and I drive the Cubs car, and people can pretty easily see the Christians driving around. And then I was crazy enough, when they went to the World Series, I went to 5 of the 7 games, including Game 7, and I went alone for Game 7 because I wanted to really focus on the game. And I sat 5 seats away from Bill Murray, and right 3 rows up from Theo Epstein, and right behind home plate, and just had the most magical moment of my life when finally it was over and we won. And I even took a video of it that I can send to you, that I show people. And it's kind of those crowning moments of your life. When I took the video of the last out when the Cubs won the World Series, and it'd been 107 years, right? So no small feat. Well,
yeah, you're in a very small club who've seen the Cubs win the series. You would be one of 40,000 people in the whole world that has ever seen that, because the 117 years before aren't around anymore.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I was proud of my Cubs, because there was actually about 2/3 Cubs fans in Cleveland for that Game 7.
Oh, I'm jealous. I'm a Cubs fan myself, so I'm jealous. So pivoting back to the topic at hand, if you had to leave our audience with one suggestion, we have a small business owner who has thought about selling, isn't actively doing anything. What's the one suggestion, the one tip that you would want them to take away from this podcast?
Yeah, this one's easy too. And we talked a little bit about it, but I'll put the hard point on it right now, is know your threshold objectives on valuation, and do the work in advance to know if that's 90% plus doable, especially as we talked about in this market, because it's such a choppy market and it's so dependent upon, are you an A company or not, or various industries are in or out of favor, and everything's changed in the ballgame of M&A. So you could have gotten 100 million last year, maybe even got an offer of 100 million last year. But the number one thing is, if you want to sell this year, make sure that you communicate the threshold valuation. Maybe that's 100 million, maybe that's 80 million, maybe it's 120 million, doesn't matter. But what's your threshold at which you will sell? and then do all the work to see if that's 90% or more achievable. If it is, go to market. If it isn't, wait. Does not make any sense to wade into these choppy waters without doing that work to make sure that your expectations are rational, real, doable, etc.
Okay, well, that's a fantastic tip. So if someone from our audience does want to reach out to you, maybe has questions, considering a process, maybe wants to engage your services, how can they find you?
C Schiller, SCHILLER at CascadiaCapital.com, or I'm on LinkedIn under Christian Schiller, and you can see me in a Cubs uniform, so that'll be the obvious one that it's me. Although I don't think there's a lot more Christian Schillers out there. And yeah, honestly, I'm not a social media guy. Unfortunately, I'm not as sophisticated as you there. But so those are the two ways. Or my cell phone, 773-562-5935.
Okay, sir. Well, thank you so much for being a guest on the Financial Bites podcast. It's been a pleasure talking about an area that I'm passionate about, and that's supporting middle market companies succeed from the life cycle of starting to exit. So thank you so much for being a guest.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Chris, and just really appreciate you putting this on to get people the information they need. So cheers.
All right, take care.